Hey guys, what is up? Super K Man Rocks here, and we are here for day number 1 of the 2025 First Stand Tournament. It's the first big international of the year. It's the first day ever of a First Stand Tournament here in the LoL Esports ecosystem. We have a new international to go over now, hopefully yearly, because we have diverted into that 3-split structure, the winter, spring, and summer, rather than just the spring and the summer. So I'm very excited to get into this. We have our big rivalry matchups kicking us off on day number 1. It's the West versus the West. It's the East versus the East. We're going to be covering both series in depth on this channel, but quickly, as a little bit of a plug, if you haven't checked out my primer video on this tournament, me going over the 5 teams that are going to be participating here, the playstyle expectations, how good I think each team is going to be, the power rankings for those teams, check that out up in the iCard. I definitely recommend, giving that a listen before you watch this. It's not required viewing or anything like that if you already have a good idea of who these teams are, but definitely if you're interested in my thoughts on where I'm expecting a lot of these teams to land, you can go ahead and check that out up there. But without further ado, let's get into the content. I don't want to waste you guys' time too much at the beginning. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in both of the best of 3s here today on day number 1, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game that we cover, and at the end of each series, I will be giving a player of the series to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We'll look at the standings at the end of the video, at the end of the episode. Remember, only one team is going to get eliminated from kind of the group stage, the round robin stage here. 4 of the 5 teams will be making it to the bracket, so you just need to not be last place. It's still very early on into the tournament. Not everybody is even playing here on day number 1, so it's not going to be like, oh, we have a very clear idea of where these teams are going to land, but both of these matchups are so influential on potentially where these teams could end up falling. These are kind of the variable matchups that we could actually have something to talk about at the end of this video, but of course that will be saved for the end. Most of today will be spent talking about the games themselves, so let's get right into it. Our first matchup of First Stand ever, and First Stand in 2025 here on day number 1, is the one we were all kind of looking forward to the most. At least I was looking forward to the most going into this tournament. It's our Western battle. It's NA versus EU. It's K-Corp taking on Team Liquid, and the reason this is so exciting and so hyped up is because honestly right now, I actually think there's a real argument to be made that either of these regions is number 3 in the world. I know that feels like a very big statement because, I think both regions would definitely argue for it right now. EU has kind of had that number 3 title for a very long time. They have been the region that has had the most top-end success historically. They've made world finals, whereas NA's not really been able to do that. They've had really consistent success with teams like G2, making it pretty far in international tournaments, but honestly, that's not really been the case so far in the last couple of years. Recent history would lead you to believe that NA is probably the better region at the current moment. You're looking at NA getting out of the group stage, getting into the quarterfinals of Worlds both of the last 2 years. You had teams like Team Liquid beating up on Fnatic last year. You had G2 in 2023 at Worlds dropping that series to Energy to end up missing out on the bracket stage. In recent history, you would kind of have results point to North America, but I think there are still a lot of people that think that that's more of an outlier, that you can't really rely on that, and that EU should still be considered number 3. This is a big telling point. K-Corp, really the first team in a while to not be G2, to make one of these tournaments as the number 1 seed. It's been quite a while. I think 2023 spring was the last time any team not named G2 ended up winning a split. That was Mad Lions, of course, in that first year of the 3-split LEC format, but I'm really interested to see how K-Corp is going to perform. We talked about it a bit in the primer, but in comparison to the other major region teams at this tournament, even really all 4 of the other teams at this tournament, they are the one with probably the least amount of international experience cumulatively. You've got players like Vladi and Khalees that just don't have any international experience. They've never played on the international stage before, and even a player like Targamas, he was only really there with G2 back in 2022, and that's obviously a very different version of Targamas. It's basically a career's worth of length between that stint of his career and now. You have a player in Kana who, it's been a little while. He's never represented Europe at an international tournament. Of course, Yike has been to basically everything over the past couple of years because of G2 as well, but K-Corp doesn't have the same kind of international experience that a lot of the other teams at this tournament do have, and so I think that really is going to be something that we're going to need to see, especially early on in this series. I want to see these players step up and not really show a ridiculous amount of nerves. I know it's a lot to ask from these players to be like, you're not allowed to be nervous, you're not allowed to go into this series and, you know, feel a little bit like you need to perform right now, but that's kind of where K-Corp have to be. We're basically starting it off with their most important series of the group stage. These are the two teams that are going to be fighting it out for the number 3 seed, most likely. I would imagine that both of these teams are going to lose to the Eastern teams. Obviously, anything can happen, but, you know, these are probably the two teams that are going to be fighting it out for that number 3 spot, which is kind of important. We know that both of the teams that are likely to get top 2 here can be rather inconsistent, and so it just puts you in a much better spot. But for Team Liquid, really what this is for them to prove that they are actually a good team. And I know that feels weird because you're running back a version of this roster that succeeded so much in 2024, just right back into 2025, but they have played so little games to start off 2025. That's really kind of the prevailing narrative for me coming out of the LTA is, yes, Team Liquid has looked pretty good in their limited sample size. They've ramped up throughout the year. They've gotten better and better each game, but they've played 1 best of 5 the entirety of the year. K-Corp has played 3, and even then, their format is still one of the lesser amounts of best of 5s in the entire world. Both HLE and Top Esports have obviously played more. CFO has played more than both of them, and for Team Liquid to only be walking in with 1 best of 5 so far in 2025, we need to see the form that this team is going to be in basically immediately. Like, there's not a lot of time, like I said, for these two teams to be able to turn it around. As for this matchup in particular, the things that I'm really looking at, I think the middle of the map is going to be really the determining factor. Team Liquid, they have a good middle of the map, especially domestically. They've had times where it's been a real big positive. APA was really excellent for the team in their playoff run, and he was really a piece that I think pushed this team forward, but that's where I expect K-Corp to be able to get their advantage in this series. Yike and Vladi have just been a better mid-jungle duo so far this year than Umti and APA have, especially because Umti has really not been all that great in the jungle. He's had a lot of really inconsistent moments, not a lot of really good tape coming out of him, and I think Yike has been tremendous so far in 2025. Everything that K-Corp could have asked for. I think obviously the other matchup that a lot of people are going to look at is Kalist versus Yon, kind of the mechanical saviors, the big prospects of each region. You know, neither of them are really prospects anymore because they're representing as the number 1 seed here at an international tournament, but, you know, Yon has really cemented himself as probably the best player in North America, and I made the claim in my primer video that he's the best player in the West. I just think that the rest of Team Liquid I have more question marks about than the rest of K-Corp, but if Yon can step up and be the best player on the Rift today, that's probably the avenue for Team Liquid to win. If Kalist and Targamas can step up and be the better bot lane between these two teams, I think that all but neutralizes any opportunity that Team Liquid is going to have to be able to win here today. And Kalist obviously getting his first taste of international action, at least at the tier 1 level, is super fun. So I'm very excited about this. Of course, a pair of former T1 top laners going up against each other. There are quite a few of those at this tournament. Kana versus Impact. You've got the rebound player in Targamas going up against Core JJ, who's been one of the most consistent supports of all time. It's a really, really fun matchup. I'm really excited to see where it goes. I predicted K-Corp to be able to pick this up. I had them higher in my power rankings, but again, I don't think these two teams are all that different in terms of what their results could be. It's all about who shows up on any given day. So the only way to know is to go game by game. It's a best of 3, so game number 1 is super important. Who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner of game number 1 was Team Liquid. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series. And again, I don't want to reiterate this point too much, but remember, this is a best of 3. It's not a best of 5. And so picking up a win in game number 1 is gigantic. It means you only have to win 1 of the final 2 games of this series. It's a really, really big advantage to pick up that early win. And K-Corp, quite frankly, just didn't have it here in game number 1. I think their draft is fine on the surface. I don't have like a gigantic issue with where they wanted to end up going with this draft. I think it's very clear that they said, you know, Team Liquid's a very slow team that we don't expect to try to play aggressive early. If we can have all of the pressure and prio around these objectives, if we feel like we can have really consistent engage alongside the Rel and the Vi, we should be able to take basically every skirmish in the mid game so long as everybody ends up showing up. We can force these 4v4s a lot more consistently, and then if we have a gold lead, like there are ways to push that in the later half of the game. The problem is they didn't have a gold lead, and that was so essential for K-Corp to get throughout this early phase because Team Liquid's comp just scales way, way better. Now, I'm not trying to say that TL's comp is perfect. I'm certainly not trying to sit here and say that they didn't have any flaws in terms of their draft. Like, there is no early game pressure here at all. Like, you're hoping and praying that APA can be in a good spot coming out of lane, and you know what? He was. He had a really good game here, and I think APA has really impressed me so far this year. I think he's actually starting to kind of brush off the reputation of being a bad early game and a bad lane player, because honestly, it's been fine this year. It's really not been an issue for him. Vladi's a good player, and APA did a good job to be able to push that matchup, but I think outside of that, I'm very concerned about what happens depends if you have to fight around Void Grubs or if you have to fight around Dragon with this comp, because I just don't know if you're going to have enough damage to be able to outpace what K-Corp have on the other side of this, because they have good engage, they have good frontline, and they probably have more proactivity in the middle of the game here. And so that's really what I'm looking at. I think the Tristana has to be a gigantic factor, at least in draft for me. Maokai is obviously huge here. It's a really nice shutdown to something like Vi, but Maokai Trist I think is a great middle of the map for TL to be able to draft, and your late game is super simple. It's double marksman and 3 tanks. Like, this is as straightforward as it gets for Team Liquid if they do get to the back half of the game, and unfortunately for K-Corp, they're not able to win the skirmishes that end up mattering. They get picked off over and over and over again, which is funny because they should be better at that than a team like Team Liquid, but TL with some really nice setups to be able to trap Yike or to be able to trap Vladi or Targamas into bad positions, and then by the time that the gold lead ends up spiraling out of control, like, it's just desperation plays coming in from K-Corp that end up really costing them. Player of the game for me in game number 1 is going to go to Umti on the Maokai. I think you could give this to Yan. I think you could give this to Core. It should go to one of those 3, in my opinion. APA was really good in this game on the Tristana. He didn't really make any mistakes, and he was influential towards why this team ended up picking up the victory, but he really wasn't, like, the driving force. At the end of the day, the jungle gap here was absolutely ginormous. Like, the jungle canyon was very real between these two players, and it's the exact opposite direction that I thought it was going to be going into this series. I just assumed that Umti was going to get outpaced and outclassed by Yike, but you know what? The most experienced international player, maybe barring Kana, on the side of K-Corp ends up being the one to actually run it down here in game number 1 and look incredibly nervous. We'll talk about Yike when we get to the K-Corp section of this, but I'm really, really proud and excited for Umti because this is maybe his best game of 2025. Like, it's so aggressive. He's constantly invading. He's constantly setting traps that Yike ends up falling into over and over again. Whatever Team Liquid and whatever Spawn saw on the scouting report when it came to K-Corp, and specifically Yike on a champion like Vi, where he's just so aggressively going over walls, using his Q, his only form of mobility to be able to engage, and not really having any ways to keep himself safe. Like, whatever they saw on tape and prep for this series was absolutely crucial for Umti to be able to take advantage of, because Yike constantly was putting himself in bad positions and basically had no way to get out of them, and the Maokai at some point was up like a ridiculous amount of gold and a ridiculous amount of XP. It's just a big credit to Umti. He's going to have to play like this throughout the rest of this tournament if they're going to want to live up to these ambitions of being like the second or third best team here, which I think are possible. If Umti is going to play like this was a ridiculously good game from him, and I think you should give him a lot of credit. Yan and Core were also really excellent. Yan was obviously the one to benefit the most in terms of damage from all of the setup on this team. It's really easy for the Varus to play out this game once they get like a 5k gold lead going into 20 minutes. At that point, he can basically just poke out the start of every single fight. There's no way that Jason Ezreal are ever going to be able to do anything to him, and as long as the rest of his team can keep the Aurora off of him on the backline, there's like actually no way that anybody ever ends up killing him. They have to go so deep in order to get any sort of damage onto the Varus, and oftentimes it's not even worth it for Yike and Targamas to do that. Yan was able to take over with that in the late game. Core was excellent in terms of the setups in this game. That 2v2 lane was phenomenal for Team Liquid just in general, and Core was a big part of that. APA was really good. Again, I don't want to say that he was bad. He had a lead in the mid lane. He was beating Vladi. He was better than Vladi in this game. Now, part of that is definitely the lane matchup, but at the end of the day, like, APA needs to be good in lane, and he has been so far this year, at least in comparison to what he's been in the past. Impact was definitely down in gold, and that was, at least to me, to be expected. I know everybody talks about how, how Jace gets neutralized by tanks and can't really play super aggressive in that regard, but I think a lot of that comes down to Jace is still going to have a pretty gigantic gold lead in this matchup. It's not like Impact can do anything to, shut down Kana. They do end up picking up a kill with a nice gank for Umti on the top side, and, Kana obviously gets a little bit behind from that, but Kana was the only win condition here for K-Corp for a majority of the game, and Impact, all he had to do was just not lose that hard. He had to make sure that the rest of this map was winning harder than Jace was winning into him, and that's exactly what ended up happening. It was just a very clean, calculated game from Team Liquid. Whatever their plan and strategy was, whatever they saw on tape against K-Corp clearly ended up coming back into play here, because they just had a great plan for this entire game. They knew exactly what they wanted to do in both draft and in game. They knew exactly what they wanted to give K-Corp in draft, like the Vi and the Jace and the Aurora. Like, they knew they wanted to give them these picks and that they had really nice counters to it, and at the end of the day, they just executed better. This was a really good game 1 win for Team Liquid, and for K-Corp, nerves, man. Like, I hate to say it, it really did look like nerves. The middle of the map was just not good enough, and you can kind of point to multiple members of this team that had bad games, but Yike is the obvious dud of the game. This was awful, awful stuff from Yike. Like, genuinely, there's nothing for me to say other than that Yike was just completely outclassed throughout the entirety of this game, constantly getting caught out by Umti, by Core, by APA, by Yan, by Impact even, right? Like, by the Ornn ultimates. Every single time Yike tried to do anything across the map, anytime he pressed Q and went over over a wall. There was somebody there to be able to take advantage of it. It was actually ridiculous. Truly one of the worst games I've ever watched Yike play, and this was a really bad time for that to happen. We needed him to be the better jungler. K-Corp needed him to be the better jungler in this game in order for them to be able to express what we thought was going to happen here. One of the big reasons why we had K-Corp over Team Liquid in my power rankings is because I just didn't think that was going to be able to, stand up to Yike, but that was definitely not the case here in game number 1. Targamas had some truly horrific engages on the rel, just being way too far forward, completely disconnected from the rest of his team. Kana's scoreline looks bad, but he was really the only one that had any chance of being able to win this game. The Jace actually was quite shut down by the tanks early on. Vladi did not have a very good game on the Aurora. Kaliste was fine on the Ezreal, but certainly didn't do enough damage to be able to justify picking that Ezreal early on in the draft to try to break through these 3 tanks. At the end of the day, like, K-Corp, once they lost this jungle matchup and once they weren't able to actually fight in the mid game over a lot of these objectives, like, what is this comp supposed to do outside of that? I actually have no idea how you win this game if you're at a goal deficit at 15, 20 minutes in, and I think that's just what ended up being the problem for them. So hopefully we can see maybe some more, like, flexibility from K-Corp's draft, but clearly Team Liquid's scouting report is coming into play here, and it's coming into effect in a positive way for them. If they have another really good strategy going into game number 2, we could be looking at a pretty quick series here, but hopefully K-Corp can bounce back. Is that going to be the case? Well, the winner of game number 2 was K-Corp. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to even up the series at 1 apiece, and thankfully, we at least get one game where both of these teams are showing up. After game number 1, I was a bit concerned that K-Corp just, like, wasn't here at the tournament yet, that they needed a little bit more time to get adjusted. Obviously, their regular season ended a lot later than everybody else's. They had a lot less time to get used to playing in Korea than everybody else did, and so you never really know what the beginning of this tournament form is going to look like for them, but they definitely showed up here in game number 2, something that I think was just a lot more comfort for them. Honestly, like, this is kind of a flip of last game, where you're talking about K-Corp having a 5v5 that I think is just better and more consistent than Team Liquid's on the other side of this. They have more options. They are able to play front to back a lot easier. They have options to be able to, play through the mid game if you do get misfortune into a really good spot, and Team Liquid is super reliant on being able to win lane, utilizing very nerfed Skarner to be able to move around the map and create early advantages, because you're not going to win a 5v5 in the later half of this game, even with Aurelion Sol, who, by the way, is by far the most important champion on Team Liquid's side in this game. Even if Aurelion Sol is in a good spot, it's just really hard for me to imagine that front to back, no gimmicks, you're just going to have enough frontline and pressure to be able to outdo Azir and outdo, like, Sejuani and Leona as Engage on the other side, or a Camille that's absolutely destroying people. Like, it just makes it a lot more difficult for me to imagine a world where that exists, and so I think Team Liquid really needed to get, like, APA into a great spot early on. That didn't happen. You needed to get Core JJ out on the map and really pressuring. That didn't happen, and once that didn't happen, like, it was kind of over. So credit to K-Corp for understanding their win condition. I think the misfortune on B4 was awesome. I think the Camille on B2 was awesome. I think both of the picks I really want to highlight, but at the end of the day, player of the game for me has got to go to Vladi in the mid lane. Vladi was definitely the standout member. I think you could theoretically give this to Yike as well in the jungle. We'll get to him in a second. Obviously, huge bounce back game considering what happened in game number 1 from Yike, but same thing for Vladi. Like, the scoreline might have not been the worst thing in the entire world, but Vladi played really poor in game number 1. To get him on something that was a lot more comfortable for him, just in general, a champion he's played so much of in the Azir, I think it's one that I'm looking out for a lot more. Obviously, Azir on B1 is something I've criticized a lot for a lot of drafts globally throughout this year, because I just don't think Azir is this, like, super splashable pick in the way that everybody wants him to be right now. I definitely think there are a lot of things in the early game that just take advantage of that. Things like Ahri or Talia that can move around the map and just create a lot more action. It's very similar to the way I just don't think that Corki is all that splashable or really playable in the mid lane right now, because he can't skirmish early. I think Azir sometimes can fall into that. Now, Azir is definitely a better champion than Corki and can do a lot more out of the mid lane. He dominates the late game even more than Corki does, and I think for that, like, Azir is still very valuable if you're going to build around him in that way, but I think there are punishable picks if you're going to pick him early in the drafting process, B1 in particular. Like, a B2, B3 Azir, I have no issue with. A B1 Azir, I have more issues with, personally, even with things like Talia banned for K-Corp in this one, but me going on that Azir rant is kind of pointless, because Vladi was awesome in this game on the Azir. He should not have gotten an early lead in this matchup. I don't think Azir should be doing all that well into Aurelion Sol. Maybe that's, like, crazy of me to say, but as somebody who plays this matchup and is, like, has has played this matchup pretty regularly in solo queue. Like, this is not one where I think Azir should be, like, ahead, in my opinion. I think Asol should have more prio, have more ability to move around the map, and have more ability to skirmish, and for Vladi to be the one to step up and still win, kind of taking away the main primary option for Team Liquid to be able to play through in this game, like, that was ginormous for K-Corp. Obviously, his mechanics on this champion are elite, some of the best that he has, and, you know, he really executed on it well. Yike was really, really great on this Sejuani. What a bounce back game. They really needed this. This was the Yike that was promised, and we'll talk about it. This was also the that was promised going into this tournament. Yike was just better here in terms of setting up and facilitating the rest of this team. Kana has had a really good start to the series. Even in game number 1, he was doing a good job on the Jace. Kalist has had a good start to the series. I think he was fine on the Ezreal, and he was really important on the Misfortune here. And Yike was really the one to kind of enable a lot of that. Sejuani is still a pick that I really value. Quite frankly, it's still my number 1 jungler in terms of what I would prioritize. I just think she does a little bit of everything in the game right now, especially when you're going to go for a lot of these late game carries. Things like Azir and Camille that are just so effortlessly dominant in the back half of the game. Sejuani really helps get you there in a way that, you know, she can fight over objectives and she can be a little bit more of a contest style jungler, but she can also just be frontline. She just doesn't have to do more than that. Like, her inherent, like, baseline traits are just so good, and I think Yike really did well in this game to be able to utilize them. Misfortune is integral towards how this comp ends up working, because Misfortune is the way that you can contest a lot of these objectives in the mid game. Obviously, Vladi winning really helped that and accelerated the process, we'll just say, but, you know, Kalist was kind of the out and the player in this game that was supposed to stabilize in the mid game, and that's exactly what he did. Those Misfortune ultimates were absolutely massive. I see a lot of people really dogging on this Misfortune champion, saying that she's kind of useless, that she doesn't really do a lot in the current meta. I disagree. I think that there are absolutely spots where Misfortune can be really valuable. This is a perfect Misfortune draft, because the ultimate can still be useful in the later part of the game where you want to play through like Sejuani, Leona frontline, and then Azir, Camille, just like diving in a bunch of situations trying to make highlight plays. Like, MF ult can obviously still be very relevant in that, but you don't have to sacrifice like early pressure in order to get something that can be useful in the back half of the game with Misfortune, especially because she's not going to be a priority for a lot of the resources that are going over to the side of K-Corp. So really big credit to Kalist for being able to pilot the MF well. Targamas that played fine on the Leona. Kana was definitely the better top laner in this game on the Camille. Finally, a Camille game that actually goes well. I've been pushing for this champion against Ambessa for so long on this channel, and we finally get a good example of what it can look like if done correctly. It feels like every single time I've called that out, the Camille has just not been useful enough, but this was a really, really good game from Kana. So overall, just a much better showcase for K-Corp, and quite frankly, this is the version of the team I expected to show up at this tournament. And then for Team Liquid on the other side, kind of a disaster class in terms of execution. Like, really, you have to win early. You have to be able to get a gold lead in this game. You don't really have a lot of ways to be able to front to back in the back half, even with the Aurelion Sol, unless something goes horribly wrong. And, you know, for Team Liquid, they just got outplayed in a variety of different areas. Yes, APA was really bad in the mid lane on the Aurelion Sol. He was definitely weaker than Vladi, and quite frankly, ran it down at times. Was completely gapped by Yike, but at the end of the day, Impact has looked not very good so far in this series. He's gonna get dud of the game for game number 2. I hate to say that I'm right on Impact in terms of the narrative that I keep spouting, but it's actually staggering how true it is that year 1 on every new team, when he first joins a team, he looks awesome, and then year 2 on that team, he looks significantly worse. It's happened every single place he's gone to throughout his entire career. It happened on Cloud9, happened on Team Liquid the first time, it happened on Evil Geniuses, it didn't get a chance to happen on FlyQuest because he left after 1 year, but it's happening right now again on Team Liquid. Like, it's just, he's not been good so far in 2025. His laning has been super subpar. He's kind of gone back to just being a guy that you can hope can survive until the team fight stage, and even the Ambessa, which was doing well for Team Liquid, domestically, it did not work here at all. Kana ends up getting the counter pick with the Camille on the other side and absolutely terrorizing this matchup. It just wasn't a good game from Impact. He looked completely outclassed when having to play something more aggressive into a player that right now I firmly believe is just kind of better than him. Yan and Core didn't really get a chance to take over. Yan is the best player on Team Liquid. If you're going to put him on something like Ashe, you better have the ability to carry elsewhere, and that just was not the case here. The Pantheon ended up not really mattering, and like I said, the middle of the map just got completely outpaced and outplayed. Team Liquid looked worse in game number 2, and if this is the kind of form that carries over into game number 3, if K-Corp, like, woke up, if you will, in game 2, and they're going to be able to play like this again, it's not going to be a particularly close game 3, because this was a dominant, like, sub-24-minute game for them. So obviously, anybody can win it. It's do or die. It's game number 3. The winner of this next game wins the series. Who's it going to be? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Team Liquid, they are gonna take game number 3. They're gonna take this series 2-1. We got 3 straight stomps, but this one might have been the worst of them all for Corp, because honestly, it felt like the trend was going in their direction, not only because game 2 looked so good, because Team Liquid drafted a comp that needed to be successful early, that needed to have priority and pressure, and let me tell you, they got that priority and pressure, but Corp drafted for scaling, drafted for the ability to play for the Zeri Yuumi out in the later half of the game, and that had been what had won, really, games 1 and 2 are the scaling comps, the comps that wanted to sit there and try to get farther and farther along, but Team Liquid was just better in terms of execution. I love the Lucian Nami bot lane in this draft. I think it really opens everything up. Of course, Nocturne Talia, like double pseudo globals here to be able to control the map. It's all just really good stuff from Team Liquid, but yet again, it's North America coming out on top at an international tournament. Like, EU's not been bad. In fact, EU should be favored going into a lot of these, but as we see, North America does step up when they're facing off against their Western rivals. Team Liquid, in particular, has done really well taking on EU teams, and this is just kind of an extension of that. There's a lot to talk about. We already talked a bit about draft, but these really are polarizing drafts in terms of what they want to do. You have the early Talia pick, the B1, which I am a huge fan of. You guys know that I really like Talia. I think she's undervalued in the meta right now, but really, this draft wasn't as much defined by the early rotation. It wasn't as much defined by the first 3 picks. It was defined by the last 2 picks for each of these teams, for the bot lanes by each of these teams. It's Zeri Yuumi taking on Lucian Nami. It is genuinely just the identity of Lucian Nami, who's going to have priority early, who should be able to fight and skirmish over a lot of these mid-game objectives super easily, versus Zeri Yuumi, who's basically inevitable in this draft and in this comp. There's going to be no real easy way to shut down Zeri with a Yuumi on top of her throughout the majority of this game if it goes beyond like 35 minutes. Like, if you go late, if you go 30 plus and the gold is relatively even, this should be in favor of Corp, but Team Liquid never allow it to get to that point. There are a lot of things that I think you could point out as like positives for Team Liquid or mistakes for Corp just in general, but really at the end of the day, the first one that's going to come to mind for a lot of people is going to be that gigantic jungle gap. We'll get to that when we talk about Yike, because to me that was more Yike than it was Umti, but player of the game for game number 3 is going to go to Yan for me on this Lucian. He had a really excellent game. I think at times it's going to go undervalued just how good he was at positioning this Lucian throughout this game, about maximizing his damage in a lot of these fights. I think that there were multiple circumstances, specifically that like 4 for 0 that really blew the game wide open for Team Liquid, where if Yan doesn't play as well in that exchange as he does, if he's not maximizing his damage as much as he is in that fight, I actually just think it's impossible for Team Liquid to win. And if they don't win that fight, maybe they don't win the game, right? Like, it's really that simple. That one fight really broke everything open, and I thought Yan really played that unbelievably well. He's just really good, man. Like, there's nothing else to say. His mechanics are amazing. His game awareness has increased tremendously over the past year. He's just turned into the best player in the West, and I will continue to die on that hill. I really do believe that that's what he has become, and I think he proved that in this series. Even with Khalees playing well on the other side of this matchup, I think Yan was better, but he's not player of the series as a whole for me. That kind of has to go to Umti in the jungle, for me at least. Like, 4 level lead, 100 CS diff in the jungle. Like, I have never seen a jungle gap quite like this from players that I just assumed would be close to evenly matched. Like, we've seen really good junglers in the LCK or in the LPL, like gap bottom tier junglers in the LCK or the LPL, just because that's kind of what you would expect from players of that caliber. Like, you would expect the best players in the world to be able to gap players that aren't nearly on their level, but to see Yike get obliterated in the way that he was obliterated in this series, you have to give player of the series to Umti. It was the most noticeable advantage that Team Liquid had throughout both of their wins, and especially for Umti to be the player that I was the most concerned about coming into this international tournament, it's just a really good sign in my opinion. He was awesome in this first series. He, ironically, maybe played this better than any best of 3 he played domestically. I certainly think there's an argument to be able to say that, but the Nocturne was really good here. The ultimates, for the most part, were used to peel and were used to kind of separate the backlines of the enemy team, and generally that's how we've seen Nocturne used throughout this year, but Corp did not really respect this pick, and certainly did not respect the damage. They were constantly walking up during Nocturne ultimates, and he was just diving onto the backline. You could tell that he was like, I'm not trying to kill your carries, but your carries are just walking up and dying. Vladi, over and over again, was constantly putting himself in a position to be taken down by the Nocturne. It was actually absurd to watch Corp play against this champion. I don't know if they just didn't prep against it, or if they just really didn't feel like Umti was going to be able to do a lot of damage, but he was really great here in game number number 3. Obviously, we're going to be looking at the level differential, but I did want to point out that he was really good in team fights. But how can you give player of the series to anybody else? Like, this was a gigantic jungle gap, and to me, was a huge reason for that. Core JJ was excellent on the Nami on B5 here. If we're going to talk about Yon, we need to talk about Core, because enabling the Lucian is a big part of why this game was so easy. APA was pretty solid on the Talia. Maybe some of the fights he could have been a bit more aggressive. Like, that's really my only complaint. This was Impact's best game of the entire series on the Cassante. This is his best champion. That has become abundantly clear, especially at international events over the past year or so. Team Liquid just kind of doing everything they want, getting everything they wanted out of this draft, a very playmaking-oriented style draft. Like, Nocturne and Talia can be everywhere. Lucian and Nami can really follow up on anything that Nocturne and Talia want to create, either on their own or separately, and then, obviously, just the gigantic gold lead that was had, constantly taking advantage of Yike or Vladi being over-positioned. It was really great stuff from Team Liquid, but for K-Corp, what happened, man? Like, what? Like, how do I even describe this game? Like, mid-jungle did not show up here. Like, I can't even begin to explain what was going on in their heads. I've already talked about it a bit. Yike is obviously done of the game. Like, what a horrible series for Yike. I get that Game 2 wasn't all that bad in comparison to Games 1 and 3, but, like, Games 1 and 3 are two of the worst games that I've watched from a jungler all year long. Like, he was just so outpaced. I mean it. Like, he was 4 levels down. If you haven't watched this game, he was 4 levels down. He was Flame Horizoned in the jungle as Xin Zhao. Like, it's completely unacceptable to watch Yike play like this. This is the worst series he has ever played, and it was just a best of 3. If he's going to play like this at this tournament, K-Corp's not going to win a game. Like, this is an unwinnable game for K-Corp, and as much as I'd like to sit here and rag on Yike and say it was entirely his fault, it was. Like, a lot of it was his fault, a lot of this series in general was him being the worst player on the Rift, because he was, but Vladi was just as bad, quite frankly, here in game number 3. Already talked about it a bit when it came to the Nocturne ultimates, but this just goes for K-Corp in general. Like, no respect, absolutely no respect given over to the side of Team Liquid. Every single time TL was looking for a play, K-Corp just assumed that they could outplay it, and they got absolutely torched for it, and nobody felt that more than Vladi throughout the beginning part of this game. Steps up a little bit too far to try and punish Yon in the middle of the map and ends up getting completely taken down by APA. Steps up way too far in the middle of this Nocturne ultimate and just gets absolutely destroyed by the Nocturne in a pivotal team fight that, like I said, was kind of the big turning point of this game, the 4-for-0 that really ended up kind of sealing things in favor of Team Liquid and making this game pretty impossible for K-Corp to win. Like, Vladi just walked up and died. Like, there was actually no excuse for what happened this game from Vladi. I think people are honestly undervaluing just how bad he was in game number 3. Genuinely one of the worst games I've ever seen him play. In fact, it probably is the worst game I've ever seen Vladi play, and Yike also may have had the worst game I've ever seen him play. And if the jungle mid was just going to get absolutely torched like they did here, yeah, no shot. They weren't going to win this. Kana actually wasn't quite useful enough on the Gnar. Again, this was really the only game in the series where Kana wasn't the best player on the team for K-Corp, so I can give him a little bit of an exception. Kaliste and Targamas were generally fine. Kaliste tried to play some of these fights out, but again, what is the Zeri supposed to do in the mid game here when the rest of his team is running it down? Xin Zhao Ahri is the part of the team that needs to stabilize in the mid game, and the fact that they were getting absolutely obliterated meant that Zeri had no way to be able to get to the part of the game where she was going to be able to take over. So overall, for K-Corp, you gotta clean this up. Like, truly, this is unacceptable in terms of gameplay. You can sit here and talk about how, like, oh, they won game number 2, they looked okay here. Overall, I don't think this was some sort of, like, unbelievable series for Team Liquid. Like, you're not sitting here talking about it as if it was, like, unwinnable for K-Corp, but game number 3 in particular just showed that this team has so many things that need to be fixed. Like, this is the worst game I've ever seen this team play, and to have that happen at first stand is just not a great time for it to happen. But for Team Liquid on the other side, congratulations on your first win. You also have some things that I think need to be cleaned up. Umti's not going to be able to get free leads like this throughout the rest of this tournament, or at least I wouldn't expect that to be the case. Impact definitely needs to start being more consistent on the top side. If they're going to put him on more aggressive picks, he has to be able to live up to that. I loved how APA, Yon, and Core played throughout the majority of this series, but still to be determined about whether or not they can translate that into Eastern teams. But at least for now, picking up a win over K-Corp puts them firmly in the spot of being the best team in the West at the current moment. But now we get to move on to our second series here of day number 1, and just like we talked about a regional rivalry for the first matchup, we definitely have one for the second. It's the LCK representative in Hanwha Life Esports taking on the LPL representative in Top Esports, and how do you not get excited for an LCK versus LPL matchup this early on into the year? This is the first LCK versus LPL matchup we will get in 2025, and honestly, I'm really excited that it's between these two teams because I think these two teams are built very similarly. Not only are both of them like pseudo super teams, like HLE obviously was kind of put together last year as a super team, bringing together, the Gen G core and then supplementing that with Zeka and Viper, players that had already been on the roster, players who had found success, world titles elsewhere to be able to create something that could compete at the top of the LCK. And Top Esports doing something similar, bringing Kanavi in to replace Tion this offseason and then bringing Crisp in to replace Mako to build upon the core that you had generated with players like Cream, Jackie Love, and 369. Really excited to see how these two face off against each other because I think their playstyles are rather similar. Not everything is the exact same, but you've got mid laners that have both been really good over the course of this year that really prioritize and focus on being aggressive and trying to win through the 1v1. Zeka in particular has really been exceptional throughout a lot of the playoff series that HLE has played an abundance of over the course of 2025 so far, but Kareem is not to be outdone. Like, he has been super integral to why Top Esports is here in the first place. Again, we've talked about his playoff run a lot on this channel, but one of the big reasons why Top Esports didn't really struggle with a lot of these really good teams is because a lot of those teams in the LPL are played through mid lane. Like, a lot of those teams rely on their mid laner being able to generate pressure, specifically some teams like Ninjas in Pajamas and JD Gaming. And for Top Esports to be able to have Cream step up and be better than a lot of those players, be better than Doenby, be better than Scout, be better than Knight, be better than Rookie in a lot of these playoff series, it's been a huge reason why Top Esports has been able to get to this spot. And obviously, the playstyle comparisons are definitely fair. Both of these two are probably the two first channel darlings I ever had, so selfishly, I am very excited to see them face off. But it's not just the mid lane matchup that excites me here. 369 taking on Zeus is a really, really fun matchup. 369 feels like he's getting back into form at the start of this year. It did start a bit slow, once again, kind of, building off of what I would say was a slower summer split for him generally in 2024, but the playoff run was really great, and especially like losers finals, grand finals, like that was a really, really good time period for 369. Those series were excellent from him. Zeus, kind of similar, wasn't all that great in the group stage, the regular season of the LCK, but as we got into these playoff series and as they got further and further, he was getting better and better, and he started to level up. He was excellent in their finals win in the LCK, so I'm excited to see how that plays out. Viper and Delight versus Jackie Love and Crisp. Jackie Love is one of the most consistent AD carries in the world, kind of really taking that Viper role after Viper left to go back to the LCK, and Viper, to his credit, he's kind of taken the inconsistent role as the AD carry. It's kind of funny because 2 years ago, you would have talked about Jackie Love as this super feast or famine AD carry that can give over so many resources, and Viper as this super consistent ADC that just has a higher floor than anybody else. They've kind of switched roles over the past 2 years, which I find really intriguing. Delight's been maybe the best support in the world so far in 2025, and Crisp finds angles that nobody can. Really, the matchup I'm looking at, though, Peanut and Kanavi in the jungle. Obviously, these are two of the best junglers of all time. You don't need me to tell you that, but this is really where you're looking at the stylistic differences. Kanavi wants to be aggressive. He wants to play very fast, very quickly, and that's kind of what defines the tempo of Top Esports, and Peanut hasn't exactly been that so far in 2025. I honestly don't think his 2025 has been all that impressive for me. He's been pretty feast or famine, pretty hit or miss. When he does play early game champions, it does kind of work out for him. Things like the Nidalee have been really positive, but I would definitely consider Peanut much more of a facilitative type of player and Kanavi a much more carry-oriented type of player. I think that's where you're really going to see the big differences in play style between these two teams, and I think that is going to determine a lot throughout this series, and so I'm excited to see where these things go. I ranked HLE at number 1 and Top Esports at number 2 in my power rankings, so I am expecting HLE to be able to pick up the win here, but I'm hopeful that Top is going to at least be able to step up and make it close, but the only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game 1, so let's get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up 1-0 in this series. And they do so off the back of basically exactly what we just talked about in the preview, drafting scaling, just saying, like, screw it, like, we're good enough in the early game to be able to win and have gold leads, or at least stay neutral throughout a lot of these games, and you're not going to be able to punish us in that way. But if we have a comp that can just win 5v5, we're really good at 5v5s. They've always been really good at 5v5s, and they definitely played for that here. I don't love their draft. Like, I think that there are things that could be punished. I like the Ezreal here to be able to complement the Azir. Typically speaking, when you see Azir and then you see like a late game AD carry, or at least something that is a little bit more hyper carry focused, you get very concerned. You know, if it's like a Jax or something on the top side, you definitely get concerned that they're just not going to have any priority in the early part of the game. But I think the Ezreal really helps kind of smooth over that transition. We'll talk about the Misfortune on the other side. Reddit hates Misfortune, and I don't really get it. I'll get into that when we get there. Delight obviously had a great game, but player of the game to me is pretty obvious. It's going to go to Zeka, and that kind of ties into what I want to talk about when it comes to the draft here, where, yes, HLE are playing for late game win conditions, but Zeka on Azir plays these laning phases so aggressively and consistently has been able to generate leads on this champion throughout the entirety of his career, and, you know, also is in a good matchup here against the Aurora, that I really wasn't expecting Top Esports to be able to run the early game like they needed to. Of course, Kanavi still was very aggressive in this game on the Vi. We will talk about that, but when you look at how Top Esports are supposed to win this, they need to be able to win through likely top lane, which is a very weird place to be, right? Like, TES doesn't really have the scaling advantage. There's no way they're ever going to be able to win a 5v5. You're hoping and praying that you can have a gold lead based off of the fact that Aurora and Vi are going to be moving around trying to find picks on the map. You can add, you know, Leona and Ken into that as well if you really want to. You have Engage in the back half of the game if you want to go for front-to-back team fights, but you really do need a gold lead in order to execute on that. The problem being you blind picked Aurora, and I would say this is Azir's best matchup in the current meta. I think Azir is excellent into Aurora. She can't really punish him in the same kind of way that other champions get punished by Aurora. I think generally speaking, like I said, I'm not a fan of blind pick Azir. This is where you pick Azir, and also you have Kennen on the top side, who you're really relying on not only to win early and get a gold lead into the Jax, because that's why you R5 it, because 369 is good at Kennen, and this is a pick that has to win in lane. But if Kennen doesn't win in lane, you have no lanes that you can actually play through. Misfortune Leona can't take advantage of Ezreal Alistar. Even if MF has more combat power early, Ezreal's just going to stay entirely safe in that lane, especially if Skarner ends up, you know, putting more priority and attention into it. And like I said, I think Azir actually has a positive matchup into Aurora, all things considered, even if he can't punish that early. Like, 369 has to win here, and all of a sudden now somebody takes exhaust and the game is over. Like, there's just absolutely no way to play this out. So that's why I wanted to bring up the Azir first and foremost, because if Zeka was worse on this Azir, or if this was like a regular Azir player, yes, this is still a good situation, but because he's already a player that has shown that he can win in lane really consistently on this champion in a matchup where I think Azir is really strong, like, all of a sudden this champion becomes pretty unstoppable in this game, and Zeka pilots it really well. I know people talk about him as a, you know, melee-only merchant. People talk about Cream as a melee-only merchant, and a Tristana-only merchant, and an Azir-only merchant, but obviously both of these players have kind of proven that that's not the case at this point. Zeka has more than shown that his Azir is like world-class, like one of the best Azir players in the world, and he absolutely came through again here. Viper was also unbelievably good on the Ezreal. This is one of those really good games we were talking about when it came to Viper. He had a couple of really bad games and their losses in the playoffs, and that was something that concerned me going up against a player like Jackie Love, who is just so mechanically talented, but Viper picked something that he's super comfortable on. You would argue that when you think of Viper, the first champion you think of is potentially Ezreal, and he just pops off. Like, his positioning in this game is absolutely flawless. The damage output in this game was incredible. Delight had an absolutely phenomenal game on the Alistar. Like, he's really solidifying his case for being the #1 support in the world, and I absolutely do believe that, at least for me, he's there right now. I don't think there is a support in terms of, like, modern tape that I would take over Delight. He just does everything at such a high level, and he's so consistent at doing it. He barely ever, if ever, runs it down. I don't think he's had, like, a bad game, like a truly awful game so far in 2025, and in this support position, that's very difficult to do, especially because Viper has not been particularly consistent. Peanut still ego picking Skarner does make it work. I think after the nerfs, this champion is just like way weaker, but I guess you can still operate it in a nice way. And Zeus was the better top laner, and certainly the more useful top laner in this game, and that just can't happen with the Kennen matchup. Like, it's unacceptable for Zeus to be better here. So really nice winning game one for HLE, and not a very good loss for Top Esports here. I just don't like their draft strategy. I think early picking the Aurora was a huge mistake. Going into Zeka with the Azir up, it just feels like such an obvious thing to be able to deal with. I know people are going to hard criticize the Misfortune, but I am not a Misfortune hater. Like, I know Reddit has a hate boner for this champion right now in terms of just how she ends up operating, but she's just very flexible. It's funny. I think we have started to get a really good idea of what Reddit prioritizes in an AD carry because they hate Misfortune, they hate Jhin, they just don't like any champion that isn't like a direct hyper carry or can't directly win the game on its own. Like, I'm surprised they haven't completely turned against Ashe at this point, but I think at that point it's just like she has too many slows. It's too obvious that she is a really good champion to completely ignore it, but Reddit always just turns on any of these champions that isn't like a solo game winner out of the AD carry role. It is what it is. I think Misfortune is totally fine. I am much more frustrated with the Aurora on R2 and the Kennen on R5. I think both of those champions are not necessarily in great spots to be able to take over. I just think Kennen's way too weak in the meta right now. Like, theoretically, this is a good game for Kennen to be able to play out, but because the champion is so easily stoppable, like, Exhaust is a summoner spell, obviously just completely shuts him down, but even outside of that, right, like, he just doesn't do enough damage to really justify the pick right now. I think that was really a problem. 369's gonna get done of the game because of it. Like, just no usefulness throughout the entirety of this game. There was no way, really, for him to be able to outplay his champion's problems, and I think that extended a little bit to Cream in the mid lane. Again, the Aurora just gets really punished in the draft phase here, and Zeka is just the better player in game number 1, which really kind of moves things out of control. Jackie Love did have a bad game, but to me, this is much more Viper just being better than Jackie Love than it is Jackie Love playing Misfortune and not having anything to do. Jackie Love's not the main character of this draft. If you're expecting MF to be able to take over this game playing into Ezreal Alistar, like, you're crazy. Like, that's just, I don't know what you expect from the champion at that point. That's not what her purpose is. We talked about it earlier in the day when Corp won with Misfortune in game number 2. We talked about how, like, MF was really valuable there because it gave Corp a lane to actually prioritize in the early game, and MF is good in the late game because that ultimate is just always valuable. She's not fantastic in the late game. There are early game champions that express dominance in these skirmishes more than something like MF, but she's pretty good throughout basically all of the game, and that's what makes her valuable. So I get why you would pick MF here, but with Aurora, with Kennen, the fact that Kanavi, we didn't even really talk about Kanavi, right? He wasn't running for dead of the game for me. Like, this guy's scoreline looks okay because he was the only one getting any kills for top esports, but the aggressiveness from Kanavi to put himself into bad situations over and over again. This is the second time today we've seen a Vi just kind of be over ambitious and kind of put herself in bad positions where she can be capitalized on. Like, it's once again one of those games where, you know, one step forward, two steps back for a jungler like this. Crisp was fine on the Leona. I don't really have any major complaints, and quite frankly, 369 and Cream didn't play all that bad. 369 had a couple of really bad moments on the Kennen. Again, his laning phase was just not good enough, but really, this is one of those drafts that I think is always going to be really tough for top esports to win, and that's why they ended up falling down 1-0, but it is just game number 1. We've already seen one game go to 3 throughout the beginning part of this tournament on day number 1. Are we going to get a second? Are we going to get a full day of games here on the kickoff day, or are HLE going to shut that down? Are they going to say, no, screw that, we want to get out of here, we want to show that we are the best team in the world at the current moment in decisive fashion? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Hanwha Life Esports. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to take this series in a clean 2-0 sweep, and they will dominate what most people consider to be their biggest competition at this tournament in top esports. Just a really good look for HLE overall. They pick a comp that they are very familiar with, something very similar to what they ended up really utilizing a lot throughout their playoff run in the LCK, just around Nidalee winning in the early game and then utilizing other counter picks to be able to get their own solo laners into really good situations, you know, understanding that Viper and Delight are probably going to be fine on the bot side, basically no matter what ends up happening, and that really does end up being the case for top esports in this one. It's just not a good look, man. You looked very outclassed. Like, it did look like there was a pretty big gap between these two teams across these two games. Obviously, game 1 was a tad bit closer, if only because Kanavi wasn't fully running it, fully sprinting it at the very least in that game just yet, but this was not a good game for top esports. This was really not a great series for them, and it does open up the question of, are the LCK really just that farther ahead in comparison to everybody else in the world right now? And Obviously, we'll have the chance to see throughout the rest of this tournament. We'll see if Top Esports can bounce back, but let's talk about the drafts first and foremost. You know, honestly, I don't hate the draft for Top Esports. I think in an ideal sense, there is a way to be able to win this, if only because I think you have to have Kalista Renata be in a good spot. I think you scale better. Your skirmishing in the mid game, theoretically, should be better. That's why you draft Nocturne Orianna, because you do want to try and fight over a lot of these objectives, and again, like, theoretically, you should be able to have that. The only thing that cannot happen in this game for Top Esports is you cannot allow Nidalee to dominate the early game. If Nidalee wins early, if they can express, HLE that is, if they can express their early game dominance, then they're going to be able to carry out a lot of the rest of this game. But look at how hard this comp falls off as we go further along. Like, you are hoping and praying that Nidalee ends up getting an early lead, because they have no way to play from a neutral state the later this game ends up going. Unlucky for Top Esports and lucky for HLE, Peanut had another fantastic Nidalee game. He's going to get player of the game here in game number 2. He just was really excellent on the Nidalee. He's been so excellent on the Nidalee. It's been his best champion by far over the course of 2025, and really this team plays around it. It's in such an intriguing manner. Peanut was just unstoppable here. You know, there was some talk about Peanut getting carried to this tournament. I think all of that has basically completely disappeared at this point, and I'm excited to see whether or not that ends up continuing on throughout the rest of the tournament. Kanavi was his biggest competition, and he just completely outplayed him in this 2-game series, but he is not player of the series as a whole for me. That's going to go to Zeka in the mid lane on this Akali in game number 2, on the Azir in game number 1. I would argue those are the two champions I think of first when I think of Zeka, are Akali and Azir. Sylas is up there as well, but Akali is such a perfect R5 here. I don't even really understand how Top Esports didn't see this one coming. You end up banning out the Nico instead of banning out the Akali, and to me, that's just like a lack of foresight. I really just can't understand where that ends up coming from. Cream ends up picking the Orianna, and what's Orianna's like historical worst matchup? Akali. It's very difficult for Orianna to be able to play out this matchup, because the part of the game where she's supposed to be helping out the Nocturne, where she's supposed to be facilitating a lot of these fights, that's where Akali's just gonna blow her up every single time on repeat. There's no way to be able to deal with that, and Zeka is maybe the best Akali player in the world, so it's definitely one of those things where it's like, I don't really know how you missed that, I don't really know how you didn't see that one coming, but even if Peanut is player of the game, Zeka's gonna get player of the series because I thought he was the most consistent throughout both of these games. But how do we not also talk about Zeus on the top side? Talk about a top gap in this game number 2. We already kind of pointed to 369 not being on Zeus's level in game number 1 when he already was on a good matchup. Now it's kind of a neutral matchup. Both of these top laners just kind of want to exist and play for the rest of their teams, and Zeus absolutely destroyed it on the Aatrox. I saw a comment that I do kind of want to push back on, and not in the way that maybe some people would think. I saw a comment saying like, oh, you know, Bin is the only LPL top laner that can go toe-to-toe with Zeus, and the reason I kind of want to push back on that is 369 gapped Bin in the playoffs. Like, he actually just did. Even if I still do believe Bin is the better top laner between those two, it's not like a gigantic difference, especially in terms of like raw mechanical skill. Zeus is just gapping everybody at the moment. Like, he's playing better than he played on T1, like, at least in terms of the current form. Like, outside of World Finals, we've not seen an extended version of time where Zeus has played the way that he has played over the past month. Like, it has looked absolutely unreal, and he actually just completely gapped 369 in this series. Viper and Delight were really good. Delight is just ridiculous on the Poppy. He goes deathless in this game, completely shuts down the Kalista, makes it basically impossible for her to play the game. Like, Nocturne obviously has a lot of problems playing into Poppy as well. Just overall, like, HLE looking incredible. A draft gap coming in from them, a gameplay gap coming in from them. And even if you want to say like, oh, well, if the Nidalee loses in the early game, then they don't really have ways to get out of it, I kind of agree with that. But if Zeus and Zeka were going to play like this, it probably didn't end up mattering in the end. So really big credit to HLE. And then for Top Esports, there's just not much else to say other than, like, you were the chosen ones. You were the team that was supposed to be able to show up and compete with Hanwha Life Esports, and it just did not happen here. Kanavi's going to get my dead of the game for game 2. Got completely out-jungled in this second game. I get that Nocturne's not going to be able to compete with Nidalee early on, and that's expected, but if you're going to draft Nocturne Orianna, if you're going to play around this, like, pick comp in the mid-game, you have to be able to get picks. Like, that's the number one thing that you need to be able to do here, and Kanavi just was not good at all in this game. He was pretty bad in game number 1 in terms of his decision-making, picking, but at the very least, he had gold for the team. He was trying to make plays. In this one, it just felt like a disaster. 369 was outplayed. Cream had a really bad game on the Orianna. Blind picking that, again, into an Akali player is ridiculous, and then the Kalista Renata was not going to be able to salvage this game. The bot lane was not the problem here in game number 2, but overall, Top Esports just did not feel like they were on the same level as HLE here on day number 1. They have some time to build up to this. I imagine this is still going to be a team that does very well throughout the rest of this, like, regular, best of 3, regular season, group stage, whatever you want to call it, process. I think by the time we hit the bracket stage, hopefully, that's enough time for Top Esports to level up to get on the level of HLE, but right now, it doesn't feel like anybody is on the level of HLE at this tournament. They are clear-cut favorites at this point to be able to take the entire thing, and it's off the back of all 5 members looking incredible. Alright, but that is going to do it for my first stand, day number 1 overview and analysis video up on the screen. The standings after the first day of action. Of course, CFO doesn't play on day number 1. They kick off their tournament on day 2 tomorrow. I'm very excited to talk about that team to see how they end up performing, but HLE and Team Liquid picking up wins today. Corp and Top Esports, of course, picking up losses. Nothing is determined, though. You just need to not be in last place. Remember, bracket stage is the top 4 teams, and so long as these teams end up rebounding, it's gonna be fine. Top Esports has a little bit of an interesting matchup tomorrow going up against Team Liquid. Team Liquid obviously, ahead of them in the standings. If TES actually loses that, it starts to become an even bigger concern with how this team is going to perform internationally, because there already are question marks with this organization, with how historically they've not performed internationally, so that'll be interesting to see. And then, of course, tomorrow we also have the Flying Oysters getting their first match against Corp, trying to get a rebound after their loss to Team Liquid. You would expect Top Esports and Corp to be able to pick up, rebound victories tomorrow, but I guess anything could happen. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Who do you think's winning tomorrow? What do you think of the games today? Always curious to hear your thoughts and opinions. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit subscribe. We're going to be covering every single day of First Stand on this channel. Of course, we'll be going through the entire group stage, and then eventually we'll be heading into the bracket stage as well, so if you're interested in that, hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.